The richness of difference, that's our conference theme. And practically everything we have discovered about being human and that we've learned from the natural and social sciences tells us that difference is the engine of growth and creativity, and it's the catalyst of the continuous remaking of our world. Even the music we play arises not out of isolation, but out of contact with other peoples, forms, and genres. Our democratic principles of free speech and expression, a free press, public education, and participatory democracy are all premised on the idea that we are a people of numerous and wildly divergent views, perspectives, experiences, and values. But as we're too often reminded, there's a gap between our espoused ideals and our reality. Being different in America is still too often associated with fear, mistrust, inequality, discrimination, and violence. You don't have to live in Baltimore or St. Louis or North Carolina to know we have a long way to go to close this gap. And I believe, as I know many of you do, that we have a role to play as citizens and as artists to live by the values that we espouse. And as we work to close that gap, we make our organization stronger and we take the orchestra experience to ever higher levels. So what are we to do? A good place to start is to be clear about what it is we're talking about. You've probably noticed that I've yet to use the word diversity. It's become a rather blunt term, glossing over many very significant distinctions, sometimes dulling our ability to focus and to act. Race, ethnicity, class, religious belief, sexual orientation, and gender identity are among the many differences we experience in our lives. Yet lumping them all together under the banner of diversity misses some very important distinctions. For example, in US orchestras, the number of musicians of Asian descent has increased by 80% over the last 5 years. And over the last 25 years, the percentage of women instrumentalists has gone from 40% to 50%. But women conductors still lag, representing only 14% of all conductors. And as we know all too well, the percent of African Americans over the past 40 years has moved from only 1.4% to 1.8%. And the number of Latino musicians from 1995 to 2014 has moved from only 1.6% to 2.4%. The dynamics at play are all different. And of course, there's far more to this conversation than numbers and representation. As we go through the next few days together, let's try to say what we mean, and let's hold one another accountable to do just that. After all, there are a lot of loaded terms associated with conversations about diversity: equity, white privilege, structural racism, inclusion, cultural equality, political correctness, intersectionality, to name just a few. And let's acknowledge that every orchestra has its own unique circumstances, and this is not a one-size-fits-all conversation. Some orchestras are in minority-majority population centers, others in predominantly white ones, while yet others have sizable Native American populations. Some of you have a long history of addressing diversity and inclusion, while others are just beginning. Wherever you come into this work is the right place for you to come into it. And that includes those of you who wonder, how in the world can we take on yet another challenge when it takes every ounce of our ingenuity and resource just to put on great concerts? I worked at orchestras very big and very small, and believe me, I know the reality of that feeling. There's never enough time and there's never enough money. And this is a time to get that feeling out on the table if that's what you think. The content of this conference is organized around the theme and how we can advance our work to realize the goal of a richness of difference. But a quick scan of our sessions will reveal a concentration on issues of race and ethnicity. It's not that other dimensions of diversity are less important, but rather there's an urgency with respect to race and ethnicity, in part because there's a pressing national conversation going on that we ignore at our peril. And the absence of racial and ethnic diversity on our stages on our staffs, in our audiences, and in our boardrooms is an immediately visible indicator of a legacy of discrimination that has yet to be significantly addressed. Conversations about diversity can be difficult. Difference causes friction and heat, and that kind of goes with the territory. Like a good stew on the stove, if it's not hot enough, the flavors won't come out and they won't come together. But if it gets too hot, it boils over. So here are a few thoughts to keep in mind so that none of us boil over. First of all, assume good intentions. That's just good for any conversation. And listen for understanding, not debate. Speak from your own experiences. Allow everyone to speak for themselves and not on behalf of an entire group. Use your curiosity as a tool. And no one knows everything, but together we know a lot. That last one, no one knows everything, together we know a lot, has special resonance for me. It is, after all, the premise of our being associated with one another through our League of American Orchestras. We've accomplished a lot together. But we're not going to rise to the challenge of diversity, inclusion, and equity by only talking among ourselves. Now is the time to listen and engage with those voices that are most different and most challenging. And this conference is chock full of opportunities to do just that. So lean in, listen hard, speak your mind, and have a great conference. Thank you very much. So we're going to get started right now, and there's no better person suited to get us started off on the next 3 days than Dr. Earl Lewis, president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. That foundation annually gives more support to orchestras than any other foundation, for which we are ever grateful. Thank you, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Dr. Lewis is a noted social historian, held faculty appointments at Emory University, the University of California at Berkeley, and the University of Michigan. He's championed the importance of diversifying the academy and connecting universities to their communities. During his address and the discussion that follows, we'll consider lessons learned from a 25-year Mellon initiative to diversify the professoriate and their implications for orchestras. Please welcome Dr. Earl Lewis.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. There we go. I know I learned a long, long time ago that actually coming to speak to anyone after lunch has a few risks. The blood is rushing to the stomach, which means that at some point your head may start to nod. And what I used to refer to as a church rock, where you're sort of like this trying to stay awake. And so if you succumb to the church rock, I understand. It is all physiology here today. Jesse, thank you for that introduction. As only Jesse knows, when I was asked, I thought, okay, I have a board meeting coming up in the next few days, and there's a lot of preparation at the foundation so that we can actually give money to both symphonies and orchestras and a range of others, stakeholders who partner with us to advance the causes of the arts and the humanities and higher education. But as I thought about this topic, and I thought that while there are always many things to do, being able to actually address the question of what we mean by difference and diversity and all the other words was important, because it goes to the core of what we've been about at the foundation for some time. We believe that there's a range of human talent, and that talent is actually critical if we're to understand and actually encourage a more fruitful and more engaging and a more involved world, and particularly as we think about the overall well-being of our democracy. And so those words, diversity, difference, democracy, well-being, animate both our current strategic efforts and have long animated what we do and why we fund and why we think grant making and the manner in which we engage is so important. We believe in philanthropic investment. And for us, that means sometimes we will find partners and work with them, not for days or weeks, but for years and decades, because the project that we're about, the work that has to be done, requires that kind of investment. Also want to acknowledge Susan Fetter and Liz Asina, my colleagues here from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and especially draw on Liz because she will recognize some of the data I'm quoting is actually from her own work and informed what I had to say here today. Decades ago, long before some of you in this room were born, I played a brass instrument. I played it well enough to be selected for the district-wide band. This is in the days of segregation. In fact, as I recall, it was the first time I ever performed with non-blacks. The experience was jarring and affirming. It was affirming because I learned that talent was important, to be sure, but little substituted for hard work and practice. In the end, I learned that I could compete. It was jarring for the first time because this was the first time that I actually came to understand that I was a minority. In my all-black world, such words had little meaning. We were all in the majority there. Now, in this space, in that band, where I would be one of a small sampling of black, also known in those days as colored or Negro children, I sensed and came to understand what it meant to be different. This was the late 1960s, nearly a decade and a half after the Supreme Court ruled in Brown 1 and Brown 2 that separate but equal was unconstitutional and that schools across my native South should desegregate with all deliberate speed. That last phrase, all deliberate speed, will become one of the most vexing directives ever issued by the highest court in this land. Across Virginia, where I was born and raised, in fact, over in Norfolk, a variety of delaying tactics, including the direct closure of schools for nearly a decade in some places, followed. So, in the late 1960s, the NAACP lawyers still appeared in federal courts in Norfolk, insisting that local municipalities comply with the judicial guidance from this court. Once they did, around 1970, 1971, the same Supreme Court would soon issue its landmark Bakke decision. Most of you know the case, but it's worth rehearsing some of the bare facts here once again. The University of California, Davis Medical School sought to improve the paltry numbers of black medical students on its campus by reserving 10 of the 100 slots for African Americans. While Davis had no history of discriminating against black students and applicants, it would insist the medical school was part of a larger society and a larger state that had done so, and hence, it had a role in addressing the history of racial discrimination. Alan Bakke, a white applicant with a background in engineering, applied and was rejected. He contended it was because of the affirmative action quota system applied by the medical school's admission office. In what amounted to a reasoned but convoluted decision, the late Justice Harry Blackmun concluded that racial quotas were unconstitutional, but that race could be one of several characteristics a university could factor into an admissions decision. The court further ruled that as one of several factors, the use of race had to advance a greater societal goal of diversity, rather than seek to remedy past histories of discrimination. This is a very pivotal moment in American life, where we said it had to actually address the societal role of diversity rather than to remedy past histories of discrimination. The diversity became to matter in this context because it was argued it improved learning for all. So the court helped to birth the diversity argument that has prevailed for almost 40 years. And I would add, for all of the complaints about race-based affirmative action, the affirmative use of race, as Thurgood Marshall and others had envisioned, was the shortest chapter in the post-Brown era. It lasted from when the schools desegregated en masse across the South around 1971 and 1972, and ended in many ways in 1978 with Bakke. While former opposition to Brown which lasted from 1955 to 1971, was twice as long. Most people forget this. The race-conscious use of affirmative action actually was the shortest chapter, 7 years, really. Opposition was twice that long, from 1955 to 1971. Since we never finished the work of race indifference, 4 decades later, we find ourselves continuing to confront the challenges of diversity. There's much, much work yet to do. As you know, a few still hold on to tired notions that some are more biologically equipped than others for certain tasks, instruments, or professions. They make these claims despite the clear evidence that all humans share 99.9% of the same genetic makeup. So at one level, all of human history and all the diversity that we recognize is about 1/10 of 1%. Ponder that for a minute. 1/10 of 1% constitutes what we think of as history, constitutes what we think of as difference. That is something for us all to consider as we look ahead in the days and years ahead. The orchestral world, as you all well know, cannot and must not shy away from entering that broader conversation about race and difference. After all, by 2050, the country will be majority minority, according to most demographers. Yet a 2014-15 survey commissioned by the League found that 85, almost 86% of the musicians who were white, 9% were Asian, 2.5% were Latino, and less than 2% were Black. Blacks and Latinos were not better represented among music directors or conductors, 4%, executive directors, 1.2%, or education and community relations directors, 5.2%. Since we live in a world that has changed and is projected to change even more profoundly in the next 3 decades, what's to be done? By 2050, the gray in America will be ever more dependent on the Black, brown, and yellow of America for basic services, tax revenues, contributions to Social Security, and overall welfare and well-being. Such a change will undoubtedly produce a wave of feelings and reactions, from alienation to the full embrace of the new America. But unless you've experienced it, being a minority indeed can be jarring, to say the least. Now today, I don't have time and I won't go deeply into the numbers, because I think the numbers themselves about this future, these next 3 to 4 decades, can sometimes produce false conclusions. But let me highlight a couple of things. When you look at the national map for 2050, you see some striking patterns. First, much of the projected racial and ethnic diversity will occur along the coast, the Atlantic coast, the Pacific coast, and the Gulf Coast. Large swaths of the interior, especially outside of major cities, will not experience the same level of diversification. Thus, those who argue, wait, the coming diversity explosion will take care of today's issues, fail to understand the patterns. Moreover, nearly 40 years of interactions show some things don't change without human intervention. Orchestras didn't achieve greater gender balance because more women entered conservatories. The conservatories and orchestras needed a plan. Your challenge is thus your opportunity. As early as 1990, Lorraine Wilson noted in her dissertation that change across the landscape rested on reasonable recruiting strategies and practices. She wrote, recruiting strategies included outreach programs, pre-college programs, linkages with elementary and secondary schools, faculty, staff, and alumni involvement, and flexible criteria for admission. Yet, given the numbers noted earlier, knowledge and proper diagnosis of the problem is no substitute for effective leadership. Ownership of the change you seek is the first order of business. If everyone is accountable, then no one is accountable. When orchestras sought to expand opportunities for female musicians, the blind audition was adopted. In this instance, individual orchestras and symphonies own the change being sought. They design the format, police its enforcement, praise its outcomes, and challenge others to replicate their success. If the goal is to produce greater racial and ethnic diversity to accompany the gender diversity, where do you begin? Who owns it? The League? Sphinx? El Sistema? In my view, this is a systems problem and a systems question that requires a systems solution. First, one must address the pipeline. Without exposure at an early age to music, private tutoring, and enrichment opportunities, such as offered by interlocking, for example, the number of students available for entry into the leading conservatories and music schools will remain woefully inadequate. But it's not just exposure. When casting a wider net in the search for talent, one invariably encounters other factors that play a role in a candidate's ultimate success. For a youngster whose family lacks considerable disposable income, there is, of course, the price of extra instruction. And as some in this room can attest, there's also something called peer pressure, positive and negative, an information gulf between students from less privileged backgrounds and those from privileged backgrounds, regardless of color. And there's the much broader social trope of, what are you going to do with that? Art making of any kind is often suspect, especially in this moment in American history and life. Saying at an early age that you aspire to become a professional musician and occupy a seat in a premier orchestra will certainly stretch the imaginations of some of your family and friends. Even if you gain the training, complete a pre-collegiate course of study, and build a sterling resume, the competition for entry into the right music program can be intense. Here, contemporary data tell a striking story. Juilliard and Curtis have among the lowest acceptance rates of any post-secondary institution in the nation. In 2014, Juilliard's was 8.4% and Curtis's was 4.8%, lower than Stanford and Harvard at 5.1% and 6% respectively. Those limitations are reflected in other outcomes. According to data from 2012, across all degree fields, at a select number of institutions, which I'll name in a moment, there were only 1,015 individuals who graduated with degrees in music performance. And they were from Berkeley, the Cleveland Institute, Curtis, IU, Indiana University, Northwestern, Oberlin, and Juilliard. And when we look at that 1,015 students, you note that a quarter were non-residents. Half were white, about 552. A tenth were Asian, about 99, with African Americans and Latinos each accounting for less than 3%, 24 and 34 graduates, respectively. There is then both an opportunity and an issue to be addressed. But let me be clear, I'm not asking for lower standards or a retreat from a commitment to excellence. In my experience, diversity and excellence are not at odds. Let me share one example, drawn from the research by complex systems scholar Scott Page. Scott has found that more complex the issue one seeks to address, the greater the benefit gained from a diverse pool of participants. In several businesses and business settings, hiring agents identified a set number of factors or variables they deemed key to success. For illustrative purposes, we will call them variables 1 through 8. Upon examination, without ever being explicit, the hiring agents preferred candidates with strengths in variables 1 through 5, seldom hiring those with strengths in variables 6 through 8. To their surprise, the teams were never as productive as initially imagined. When one team decided to mix in folks strong on 6 through 8 with the 1 through 5, productivity shot way up. Now guess what? The 6 through 8 folks also had different ethnic and demographic characteristics than the 1 through 5s. Here, an unstated preference actually impeded team success rather than enhanced it. In this example, difference exposed a fuller meaning of excellence. Excavating the assumptions about what constitutes talent is part of the process, but not the entire solution, obviously. While every program may insist it has an interest in promoting and furthering diversity, too often, it is accomplished in a siloed manner without significant scaling. Mellon's own experience with trying to increase the numbers of individuals of color and first-generation students who go on to earn PhDs and join the professoriate may be informative. For more than 25 years, the foundation has invited a select number of colleges and universities into a partnership. About 50 colleges and universities and another 41 HBCUs are part of this network of institutions. The schools identify promising students of color in their sophomore year and invite them into a program intended to send them to graduate school and ultimately into the academy. If the students fulfill their promise to enroll in a Mellon-supported PhD area, we cover the cost of key aspects of their graduate study and provide a stipend for dissertation research, and we also cover up to $10,000 of loan debt from their undergraduate days. But I want to make a point. It's more than money that's provided. Beginning in their sophomore years, the students enter a community of like-minded scholars on their campuses. At the most successful institutions as measured by throughput, that is those who go on to earn a PhD, students are jointly mentored by faculty members and peers. Students learn early on the value and importance of networks. They find that a community of scholars exists, and some are currently presidents and provosts of leading institutions. The peer-to-peer advising is critically important as well, as is the high expectation of faculties and faculty members. Faculty, in turn, are a part of a national network, too. Each year at an annual meeting, coordinators from the participating campuses meet to exchange experiences and best practices. This practice of sharing knowledge is key to the scaling the MMUF program has realized over the 2+ decades. And I want to pause for a moment and emphasize something very, very important. We are where we are in 2016 because we didn't quit the efforts after 5 years or 10 years. Had we quit after 5 or 10 years, we would not be talking about a success. We would be talking about an experiment that never realized its potential. But because we stayed at it for 25 years, we now have 600 graduates and another 700 graduates in the pipeline. Right? Some things that are important require time and diligence and attention and staying the course. From our recent grant making, I draw your attention to a grant between the Associated Colleges of the Midwest and the CIC, or the Consortium on Interinstitutional Cooperation. ACM is a consortium of liberal arts colleges in the Great Lakes area, and the CIC is the Big Ten group plus the University of Chicago. This grant is a pathways program that sends undergraduates from the ACM schools to grad programs at the CIC schools. In return, the CIC schools place postdocs with the ACM schools in areas of critical need. In this case, the acceptance of the postdoc comes with an expectation of permanent employment. And think about that. Such an agreement is game-changing. It's not that you bring in a postdoc into your system. You're bringing a postdoc in with the expectation they will become a member of your faculty. That allows you then to really tap talent early on and to get first dibs on graduate students, and ultimately with the goal of diversifying the faculty at these institutions. Here, this goal of diversification of the faculty and the model is for us a new experiment in both pathway and pipeline development. Of course, there are examples of diversity programs in the orchestral world. The Baltimore Symphony Orchestra has the Orchestras Fellows Program, which is a one-year fellowship for a string player from an underrepresented community. Chicago Sinfonietta has the Project Inclusion Program that accommodates 4 to 6 string players on a 1 to 2 year commitment and 3 conductors with an appointment for 1 to 2 years. The Detroit Symphony Orchestra has created the African American Fellowship Program, which aims to support 1 fellow any instrument for 1 to 2 years. And then there's examples from Pittsburgh and elsewhere of programs that are being developed or have been developed or are part of what's known. Similarly, a number of orchestras and symphonies have introduced pathway development programs and other efforts to address diversity. So it's not the case that this community has not crafted solutions or partial solutions. And no doubt you are aware of a number, the Boston Symphony Project's STEP, which is designed to prepare K through 12 musicians from underrepresented communities to pursue musical careers. Or the Eastman Schools Pathway Program, which is a program for 5th to 12th graders from the Rochester City Schools District, and where they begin instrumental instruction in their city schools and are eligible for the Pathway Program as they advance. And this program has up to 70 students who are participating, and under its provisions, any student who can gain admission to Eastman and had completed the Pathways program will actually receive a full scholarship. Those are all important endeavors, all important endeavors. So if the issue is developing a pipeline, I would suggest models exist. If the need is for the pipeline to produce pathways, there are also models that exist. The real question, in my view, is there the will and the determination to do something significant? Change does not come easily, and it doesn't come without struggle. Diversifying the musicians must be as important as diversifying your audiences. Both, I will argue, will be required if you are to survive and thrive in the decades ahead. This will mean experimenting with the canons, challenging basic assumptions about who is qualified and what it means to be qualified, pursuing models that work and should be replicated, and building a connected, integrated approach that scales. It is not the story of a series of one-offs that failed to make a substantial difference. I never pursued music beyond high school because no one made it compelling. That made sense for me. But I had a classmate in junior high school named Jesse Hawkins. He went off to a special school to develop his talents. Where's Jesse today? In fact, he may actually be here. So if so, I hope to get reintroduced after all these decades. But I used to ask the question, how many Jessies have we missed because the accident of birth that has you born into one family rather than another has overly determined the makeup of today's orchestras? We can do better. We must do better. Boards must set an example and endorse the efforts. Orchestral leaders must devise workable plans. Schools must work collaboratively to build and sustain a pool. Orchestras and symphonies must hire. When I say this, it all sounds so simple. Oh, so simple. But because change of this magnitude is not linear, it is anything but simple. Nonetheless, we must mount a program that is truly, truly worthy of you, your talents, visions, and commitment. At the Mellon Foundation, we count on you to lead. And in us, you will find a supporter and a willing and able partner. Thank you.
Thank you, Earl. You kind of pulled back the complexity of all this, but at the same time gave us a tremendous sense of hopefulness with some of the successful work that's happened in academia. So thank you for all of that, and we're glad you're sticking around because we have more to do. And to help us in the next part of the session, we have with us Jamie Bennett. And Jamie is the Executive Director of ArtPlace America since 2014. Before that, he served as Chief of Staff at the National Endowment for the Arts and Chief of Staff at the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. He's also provided strategic counsel at the Agnes Gunn Foundation, serves as Chief of Staff. You've been a chief of a lot of staffs. of the president of Columbia University, and worked in fundraising at the Museum of Modern Art, the New York Philharmonic, and Columbia College. Please welcome Jamie Bennett.
Great. So one of the best things about being a chief of staff is that you're always great adjacent. And once again, I happen to be great adjacent. We're thrilled to be joined by Marin Alsop, backer, host, and the music director of the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, and Alex Laing, principal clarinetist from the Phoenix Symphony Orchestra. I got that correct. So the League has worked very hard to program the 3 days that we're together and explore this theme of the richness of difference. And I think we're sitting here as a music director, as a musician, as a philanthropic leader, and are going to sort of launch us on 3 days of conversation that will culminate in Marin and Alex and I coming back together along with an executive director and a board member to talk about what we've learned, and most importantly, what are we going to go home and do differently next week, right? What are we going to start doing on Monday? And so our time together here in the next sort of 30 minutes, I think, is spent setting a baseline, beginning the conversation for where we'd like to go. And one of the things that's come up in one of the pre-sessions this morning and in many of our prep calls and all of that is the question of, is there a problem we need to solve? Right? We heard the numbers that both Jesse and Earl laid out. 84% of symphony musicians are white, 4.2% are African-American Latino, 16% of conductors are female. Is this a problem? Is this something we need to solve? Marin, let me start with you, because this is your house. You know, is there an urgency? Is there something that can no longer continue the way it is?
Well, I mean, I can speak from my own personal experience, which I feel there is an urgency, but I'm getting pretty old now, so I don't know. I mean, from my perspective as a woman on the podium, I do think, you know, when I started in my career, I just assumed that there would be more women soon to follow. It just felt natural, you know, okay, this is the trend and this is where we're going. And then, you know, 10 years later, I noticed, and 20 years and 30 years. And then I realized that, okay, unless I try to be part of a solution, if I don't try to change this landscape, who's really going to change this landscape? So I started a fellowship for women conductors, and there are a couple of them here today. Welcome. And I
mean, the fellows here? Raise your hands if you're one of the female fellows.
Valentina,
welcome.
Are you here? Yep. And you know, just speaking from my own personal perspective, that I'm not sure how much that moved things forward, but at least I was part of a proactive, you know, action. And to me, that's the place where we are. There's nothing, as you were saying, it's not a straight line, but if you're part of being proactive, I think you're always right. This is my view, even if your action might be wrong in the moment. So I do believe, and I'm not sure it's the same issue for the different elements of diversity, because it's clear to me, after working with our orchids, you know, for these past 8 years, that every child is born a genius. It's just, we just suck it out of them or we deny them access. And it's often for economic reasons. So to me, it's clear that we have something, we have to take action because we have a responsibility. And the theme of this, you know, the richness of difference, I don't want to take all the time speaking, but my experience now in South America, in Brazil, where I conduct an orchestra that's about 70% Brazilian and then 30% from 17 other countries. I can't tell you what a rich experience that is, that I feel I'm really committed to the idea that diversity creates depth and dimension, and it's a wonderful thing. So, even though I will go hear the Vienna Philharmonic, I do it reluctantly because of the lack of diversity. And really, I believe wholeheartedly in diversity, and we have to take action to change the landscape.
So, Alex, let me ask you the same question. Is there something urgent and unacceptable that's demanding action of us as a symphony orchestra community?
Yeah, well, I think that that question can be taken from a number of different angles, right? So I think I can answer it from a personal perspective. I think that there's obviously then the individual institutional perspectives. In terms of trying to find something that is objective in terms of whether or not there's urgency, I think that our communities and our funders are creating a sense of urgency that can't be denied, right? So I think that that is a pathway sort of into this, finding a sense of urgency that maybe everyone can relate to.
Well, Earl, let's go to that notion of urgency, and you sort of brought up some of the comparisons and the parallels with the education system. And in that case, it took 2 significant law cases for change to happen. What is it going to take for us to make a change? Do we need some sort of external force? Do we need our version of Brown v. Board of Ed?
I'm hoping, actually, that this community and other communities actually can learn from the past and not leave it to the courts. Because once it enters the courts, certain things become clear and certain options become more limited. And in part because they become constitutional questions as to whether or not it violates the First or the 14th or the 13th Amendments in a way. If you move back to the question of asking, what does the nation need now, and what is it projected to need 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now? And so I had this line in my talk about the grain of America. And the grain of America is for me and others, for those of us in our 60s and older, we can look out 10, 15, 20 years from now and realize that there are other people we're dependent upon. And so I'll illustrate it with an example. A friend of mine in LA was having this conversation with some community leaders near Anaheim. And the Anaheim folks couldn't figure out why in the world they actually should pay more taxes for the schools because they no longer had children in the schools. And finally, someone turned to them and said, let me ask you a simple question. Don't you expect at some point to sell your house? And the person said, yes. He says, well, who do you think is going to buy that house? If you haven't invested in the schools so that those young people can actually then go on to have a life and a well-being that allows them to buy a house, you have no investment. So their investment in them is an investment in you. And so this is in some ways the story I guess I would tell more generally about diversity. An investment in the other at this moment is an investment in the individual and a collective sense of who we are.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, on that, I mean, I think that, obviously the fact that some of our major funders are putting this on the agenda puts it on all of our agendas by definition. But at the same time, I think our communities are putting this on our agenda, right? We need to be representative and connected to the cities whose name we bear, right? And if you even peel it back a little bit farther, the monies that were planted as endowments and donations to allow this art form to exist, this is money that's protected from taxes, right? So it's not going to roads and schools and hospitals and such. It's supposed to go to something that's supposed to serve the public. And if the fact that we don't, in our backstage or on stage or boardroom or administrative offices, look like and can relate to the community that we are a part of, that is going to make it difficult for us to I think, successfully, authentically bear the name of the cities and communities that we claim to be of.
So I think you both have raised I think, the crucial question, right? So I'm going to say the dumbest thing in the world, that in order for something to change, it means that tomorrow needs to look different, right? That's a definition of change. It can't look the same as yesterday. So if we want to be more engaged with our communities, if we want our communities to be more part of an orchestra, one of the things that's very important whenever you go into a change management situation is deciding sort of what is sacred. What is there a bright line drawn around that cannot change because we would no longer be a symphony orchestra? And once you've drawn that line, everything else needs to be on the table to change. So let me, Marin, start with you. What can't we change about symphony orchestras? What is so essential to a symphony orchestra being a symphony orchestra that it cannot change?
Well, I think that the quest for artistic excellence and the artistic integrity cannot change. And I think what we do fundamentally cannot change. We're presenting this repertoire and at the highest possible level. I think, to me, these are the only elements that are sacrosanct. They cannot be changed, but that leaves room for a heck of a lot of change around it.
Well, and just digging into one aspect, and then Alex, I'd love to ask the same question of you. When you say this repertoire, are we talking about sort of the Western European canon? What is this repertoire that is central to who we are as orchestras?
I mean, listen, this is, even saying that, I'm thinking, oh, does that really accurately convey what I'm trying to mean? I'm not sure it does, because I've watched us over the last 8 years or 10 years talk about artistic excellence and what does that mean. And, you know, the musicians, I think, and I have come a long way to understanding that this quest for perfection, I'm not saying it's overrated, not by any stretch of the imagination, but I think there are other quests that have similar value. And sometimes the human experience component can rival the artistic excellence. And it's very, very hard for us as professionals at the top of our game to somehow accept that we may have a different measuring stick, you know? So sometimes we have that talk. I have that talk with the musicians of the Baltimore Symphony, and they understand it, that this may not be an outing where our goal is artistic perfection, but it's human experience. And musicians understand this. They do. But I think we have to understand where that balance is. So as I was talking about those sort of sacred cows that we don't want to touch, I was realizing that maybe even that is up for discussion.
So great musicians playing great music, is that the beginning of
It sounds
core?
like every one of our mission statements, doesn't it? That thing in your bottom drawer. We're going to play the best music for the most people at the best level. Isn't that what every mission statement says? But maybe the mission statements need to change.
Right. So from a musician's point of view, from where you sit, what is it that makes an orchestra that cannot change?
Right. So I think what I don't know, honestly, right? So I can't speak authoritatively for everyone or everything.
You.
But for me in this moment, I would say that the canon can't change. So the works and the techniques that they require that are fundamental to the skill set, that composers are drawing upon, that they have now studied and are trying to play with or change in order to present music to us that we can then turn into sound. So I would say that the canon is can't change. That doesn't mean that we can't do other things or add to it. I do a lot of different things in my work. And I think that has implications, right? That has implications for the forces that is required to make the music. So the number of bodies that is going to be on stage, and then that has implications, right? Because that's going to have implications for the size of the organization, and then that's going to have implications. So I mean, I think just from that idea that let's take, the sort of archetypal example, which is Beethoven 9, or it could be any, fill in the blank, but you get the point. If that's taken as, if an orchestra can't do that, then I don't know if we would call, or if a symphony orchestra, actually I learned this from Dan yesterday, if a symphony orchestra can't do that, then maybe it's not a symphony orchestra. And then I think that there's sort of a cascading implications from that.
So, Earl, let me ask you about the canon, because this is something that sort of goes from the symphony world to the world of education. And there was an article, I think it was maybe in the New York Times, that was taking on departments of philosophy in higher education. And they said, we need to stop calling these departments of philosophy, and we need to start calling these departments of white Western European philosophy, because that's what the canon is, right? And that's what's being taught. So can you talk a little bit about that notion of the canon and what we mean by it, what it doesn't mean, the barriers it puts up?
Okay, I'm going to limit myself. This is 30 years of argument.
Right.
And I'm going to try to condense me. I started my teaching career in 1984 at Berkeley in African American Studies, and spent 5 years at Berkeley before I moved to Michigan. And I can remember a conversation I once had with my late colleague, Barbara Christian. And Barbara was the first African American woman to ever gain tenure at the University of California at Berkeley. And she did it as a literary critic. And she was actually writing on black women writers. And when she started writing, people would say, there are no black women writers worthy of consideration. What are you doing? And it was Alice Walker, among others, and then Toni Morrison and others. And all of a sudden, you sort of think, this is the mid-1970s when Barbara starts this work. I joined the faculty there in 1984, as I said. She had to fight for 10 years to get people to recognize that Toni Morrison actually was important. Now we look at 2016 and she's won a Nobel Prize and everything else, and she's a part of the canon. But as Toni Morrison and Alice Walker both have said, it took the critics like Barbara Christian to come in to validate their work. And in turn, as they produced more work and became more prolific and entered more spaces, it gave validation to the critics that this work actually is important. And I would argue, and I'm a historian and write in African American history, that it has been, if you look at the literature that's been produced in the last 40 years, some of the most important books that have augmented our understanding of American history have dealt with aspects of the African American past. But that was also part of a fight over who gets to be included. I can remember at dinner with one of my former colleagues at Michigan, and at that point is what I recall my retirement book, the book I'm going to write in retirement. And I'm still collecting data, but it's a social and cultural history of black school teachers from the late mid-19th century through the middle of the 20th century. So I was explaining this to one of my colleagues, and he looked at me and he was all serious. He goes, but how can you write about black school teachers without writing about white school teachers? And I remember looking at him.
Wait, Earl, say that one more time.
Yeah, he
say
said
that
to me,
sentence one more time.
How can you write about black school teachers without writing about white school teachers? And I paused and put my fork down, and because we're at dinner. And I said, the same way you can write about white intellectual leaders without writing about black ones. It's this notion about what's normative and who gets included and who gets to sort of set the standard. And so I actually think a lot about the work, at least in the academy over the last 3 to 4 decades, has not just been about then the canon, but realizing the canon itself actually was formed and is reformed and is going to be reformed again. And so part of the challenge is to figure out how do you enter into that process and that project of reformation. And so I'll conclude with an answer. One way I realized that I could do it in partnership with others is actually to then create a book series that actually brought together a whole new perspective on American and ethnic history in the United States. We called it American Crossroads. It's a coming together of people at the intersections of encounter. And 40 books in now, 20 years later, half of those books have gone on to win awards, including at least one of my colleagues who won a MacArthur as a result of that, the book in that series, is begin to actually think about how you change the canon, is to figure out how you enter the canon.
And I think, it's such an important question, and someone recently put it to me a little more forcefully, which is my story gets told in history class. My African-American colleague's story gets told in an elective, right? So there's a lot of judgment that comes into what is considered universal and what is considered an elective sort of stuff.
I would also just like to say that This has been the case for women throughout history, so we shouldn't forget that. You know, every single thing that we held as sacred in the concert hall, at least that I was told, you know, when I first began conducting and I wanted to speak to the audience, I was told, no, you can't do that. You know, every single step of the way, I was told, no, that's not permitted. That's not permitted. And I guess my charge to you is to say, I think as soon as you hear you can't do that, I think you just have to put that on your agenda list as a to-do.
Are you ready to endorse a political candidate for president? No. So stop. So let's switch to the other side of that. So there's something around the musicianship that we're saying is central to the definition of the symphony orchestra, and that can't change. So everything else can. And one of the things that's come up in every conversation I've had around this is the audition process, right? There's the blind audition process, which we put into place as a community because we believe it is 100% fair. And the numbers haven't moved, right? In terms of African American and Latino musicians, 1.2 to 1.4%.
I would argue with that, notion that we all believe it's 100% fair. I think that musicians would agree with me that it's the best thing we could come up with to date. But that process now hasn't evolved and hasn't changed since the anonymous screen was put in, which is, I don't know when, does anybody know the year? I don't remember, but it was the late 60s, it must have been though, late 60s. So that hasn't changed. I just want to say on behalf of the musicians that I think we all agree that it's just the best we've come up with, but we haven't thought about it beyond that.
So let's push on that a little bit. So what are some of the things that might need to change, or what are some ways that we might need to tweak with that? Alex, Marin?
Yeah, over to you, Alex.
I got ideas.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think we first have to say, like, what are we trying to do, right? So what's the goal? And, you know, I mean, I will say that the idea that we should take the screen down at some point and begin to consider the needs of the organization to diversify the stage in order to tell different stories about who we are and where we are and what we mean, I think that has some difficult implications. And I say this as someone who's the only African American on his stage. I say his because I'm a man. You know, every concert. So here's how I see it in that regard. One of the biggest, we're here to talk about the richness of difference and diversity, and one of the biggest sort of axes of diversity that's happening in our orchestras right now is generational, right? I mean, we can all speak to that. We are in these positions for a long time, then we retire, and a new person comes in. They're invariably, possibly, likely young enough to be our child. They're now tasked with maybe taking over a leadership position in an orchestra in which a section in which they are young enough to be the child of many of those people. And we're not, as musicians, really given very much guidance beyond our own sort of good sense and home training about how to navigate that. And that can be difficult at times. I think to then add to that a dynamic in which you have some members of the orchestra who gained admission to these elite institutions that you spend your whole life training for, gained admission through one door, right, that is not perfect, but designed to prevent bias, and another which is designed with different intents. I think that is a recipe for real tension. And you know, the job of a musician in large part is to stick the landing, right? That's what we're there to do. In front of a whole bunch of people, like, that's why the audition process is so rigorous, because you gotta stick the landing. And the truth is, you don't always stick the landing. I mean, that's just real life. And hopefully, you know, that doesn't happen very often, because it feels like your world just ended. But I think to have the experience of that happening. Let's say you're in a leadership position, you're a principal player, you don't stick the landing, or you're a section player and everyone around you hears you not stick the landing. To be wondering if people are looking at you side-eyed, like this confirms that, see, that's why you came in through that door. That's a lot. And so I am cautious about taking down the screen and in real time, now there are orchestras, Chicago Sinfonietta is here, there are orchestras, I don't know how they use the screen, but Chicago Sinfonietta has articulated a different set of values for themselves and a different story they're trying to tell about this music, themselves, and their city. And so I think, I can't speak for them, and hopefully maybe they will be able to speak for themselves about what their audition process is like. That's a different setting than the setting I'm familiar with in the Phoenix Symphony, and the setting that in the Phoenix Symphony I think is very typical in terms of the screen stays up until the finals, comes down in the finals, at which point you're really looking for more sort of a who's the right fit for us. It's not really about trying to see if someone can pass a test. You feel like the test has been completed at that
But
point.
maybe we're looking even at barriers long before the screened audition. You know, the cost of going to an audition is it can be prohibitive for people. So, and if you play a big instrument, you need to buy 2 plane tickets, you know, and the guarantee of any results, positive results, is the odds are against you. So maybe we need to look at how do we provide access to people who don't have the resources even to get to the audition and be part of the process.
I can't speak directly to what it means to be a musician and thinking about sticking, but let me draw an analog. And for those of you who had the good fortune of actually paying several $100s to actually see Hamilton on Broadway, or if you saw it at the Public, I'm reminded of, as a historian, all of those characters, right? They are the founding fathers of America. They all came from European ancestry. And then you sit on that stage, when you sit in a theater and you watch these actors who are black and brown and Asian playing the roles in Hamilton, inhabiting Hamilton and Washington and Jefferson and Madison. And all of a sudden, their talent actually gets to come out. And it transforms our ability to imagine what's real. Now, it took Lin-Manuel to say, you know what, I'm not going to go with the traditional actors who would play these roles. We're actually going to bring in someone, we're going to put a little hip-hop in, we're going to change it a little bit. But boy, you know, as I remind people, it's probably the only place in space in America in the last decade where the Cheneys and the Obamas could actually see the same thing and agree.
Yeah, please.
So on that, one, just to circle back, I agree that there are things that we can do to bring more diversity to our pool of candidates. There are things that we can do to try to mirror and replicate what Mellon is doing with trying to diversify the professorial, right? And it involves, it's amazing, right? So you start that process when you're a sophomore in college, looking to pay dividends on that one individual 8-9 years down the road. And I think there are things that we can do in that regard. So I absolutely agree. And on the Hamilton thing, I had the great pleasure of playing last summer in the Gateways Festival Orchestra. Shout out to Lee Kuntz, who's in the house, I think. And yeah, he deserves a round. Let's give Lee a round of applause. Absolutely. And, one of the things that is, I think, before we played a note, because you're talking about playing with archetypes. Yeah. And before we played a note, an all-black orchestra is saying something. Yeah. Because the archetype of an orchestra is not that, right? So it certainly adds, you're talking about the richness of difference, it added a level of discourse. It added a level of investigation. It added a level of inquiry to the concert. Now, whether or not someone stayed in that level the whole concert is a personal thing. It may have been in something that they were into at one point, and then they were swept away in the music of Ravel or Florence Price. I don't know, but it certainly is not insignificant.
Yeah, and I guess what I was suggesting is to piggyback, that part of imagining a future is being willing to experiment along the way. And if we keep doing the same things, the same ways, and we end up with the same results, then it's a little surprise we never get to Jamie's change. And so the challenge for all of us is to figure out what's our comfort level for a certain amount of experimentation, And because with that, you also began to perhaps alter imagination. And at least it's been my experience, it requires the interaction between experimentation and imagination to sometimes actually realize a change.
I think that's so important. So there's so much to discuss, but our time together in this setting on stage is drawing to a close. So I'm going to come to each of you for a final thought, and would love for you to think for a moment about the change we'd like to see. Would love for you to think for a moment about what all deliberate speed looks like in the symphony orchestra world. Would love for you to think a minute about what we have to give up from yesterday in order to get to the tomorrow we want. And I want you to think through what is a thought that you'd like to share with our colleagues as we enter into these conversations for the next 2 days. What is a way that you'd like them to keep their ears open, a way that you would like them to keep their eyes open, a way that you would like them to engage? What is sort of your parting pearl of wisdom, Earl?
Well, I think part of it is to realize that, one, there is some urgency, but time actually has intervals. And that what can be accomplished in the next 5 years is not what can be accomplished in the next 15 years. And that as you begin to chart out a plan, don't confuse 15-year part with the 5-year part. Otherwise, you'll become frustrated, and you'll step back and trying to figure out why nothing has changed. But change is possible. Change is part of who we are. We're human beings. It actually helps to really contextualize the human condition and the human experience.
Human beings, we're gerunds. So if you're an etymologist. Alex, let me come to you. What would you like people to leave this discussion thinking about?
So I'd like to jump ahead to imagining that we've actually achieved this change, and the stage is more diverse. And I'd like us to think about how that happened and the training that these musicians went through, and then ask ourselves if our institutions structurally are going to be ready to download and access everything that these musicians have to offer. Because they're going to be coming up through current and existing programs, new programs like OrCids, and I think their expectations about how they express their creativity, how they participate in the strategic direction of their own personal careers, which are completely tied to the organizations that they are a part of. I think they're going to have real aspirations in this regard, and I think that the current design, so diversity is representation. So if we have the bodies on stage, we've got representation, but orchestras are structured in a very siloed way, we all know this, and I think they're structured with the musicians as the hands of the organization and other people as the brains of the organization. And I think that unless we start to examine that, I think that there's going to be a tension or a rejection, right, by this coming generation of musicians of our institutions, because I don't think they're going to want to just be hands. I think they're going to want to play a real active role in the music making, and that means where it's being made and how it's being made. Again, I heard Lee actually talking about his excitement about musicians who could play Bach and Mozart and Brahms, and also loved and could play with the music of Beyonce and Jay-Z. And I'd like us to maybe think one step beyond that, and not only if they play the music of Beyonce and Jay-Z and Bach and Brahms and all this, but what if they think like Beyonce and Jay-Z and actually Bach, right? And they think entrepreneurially. You know, are our organizations set up to engage and download and access and leverage all that this coming generation might have to offer?
Fabulous, thank you. Marin, you've invited us into your house. What would you like us to think about as we exit back out?
Well, I hope you have a wonderful time here in Baltimore. The weather's always like this, just remember that. And I would say, to your point also, Alex, I think our greatest resource as a symphony orchestra is our pool of talent, our incredible musicians, world-class musicians. And I think that it's time that we figure out a way to a bypass might not be the right word, but somehow let's move past the adversarial management-labor relationship. I think that this is a stumbling block, and we lose a huge resource by not being able to work together. And I would say that if we could all get up tomorrow, or even before you go to sleep tonight, and review what kind of citizens of the world were we collaboratively today, then, I mean, may sound very Pollyanna, but I really believe wholeheartedly that every day we have to, that's what makes me feel good anyway, that idea. And when I'm able to feel that collective goal with my musicians, I think it's as exciting as an inspired performance, and that should be our goal.
That's fantastic. Please please join me in thanking Earl and Marin and Alex.
Thank you. Don't all go. There are important announcements. Also, I'm supposed to synthesize again. They keep making me the synthesizer. So just a couple of observations. Our panel was asked to tell us how to take Earl's perspective and bring it home to orchestras. And there's an awful lot of ideas that came out. None of them are particularly practical, like this is what I'm going to do when I get home. But one of the things that I'd like to observe is I think we would all agree this is a highly intelligent conversation that we just listened to. And I think one of the ingredients had to do with the fact we had two musicians in the conversation. One of them was a music director. And I think having our artistic leaders part of this conversation is essential. Having musicians in this conversation is essential. And having people like Earl, who with one hat is a scholar, and he's a scholar outside of our community, yet obviously brings extraordinary perspective. So in some sense, what we've just listened to is really a model of the kind of conversations that we all ought to be having back in our individual orchestras. And just to pick up on a couple of really strong ideas, the work is long-term. It doesn't happen unless we are proactive. The canon obviously needs great conversation and examination. And a plug here for Symphony Magazine, there's an interview with Bill Rausch, the artistic director of the Oregon Shakespeare Theater. And if you want to talk about a canon, they got a canon, but they also deliver their theatrical work in ways you wouldn't believe that make it so integral to today's world. So take a look at that. Auditions, I think we still don't know if this is harmful or hurtful. The question about excellence versus and human experience, wonderfully rich and important conversation to have. I can't tell you how many musicians have said to me that the most important musical experiences of their lives have happened not on the stage in their concert halls, but in situations where they were close to other people who needed them to be there. And maybe this is part of the audition question, is maybe there are a wider range of considerations that we need to be thinking about, not to eliminate the ability to execute in the orchestral repertoire, but there are other things that matter in what a musician can bring to an orchestra. And finally, some really, I think, wonderful, fresh arguments for diversity that go beyond our, the business case for the diversity, the moral case for diversity. We heard cases for diversity that have to do with the quality of music making and also with the quality of problem solving. And I think, to me, these are really essential because we are about making music, and to imagine that having more different types of people making music, as Marin described in Brazil, to me, this is fundamental and core. So lots of great stuff to think about. So again, thank you to our panel. And now some quick announcements. Don't go. Okay, so here's what's happening next. Constituency group meetings start at 4:15. Unless you're in group 1, you start at 4 because you got lots to talk about. Got to get a head start. And then at 5:30, we have the reception for everybody in the exhibit area. And this is the most important thing. If you have already given to the League's 2016 annual fund, pick up your Baltimore pin recognizing your generous gift. But if you haven't, it's not too late. So if you make a $25 gift or more during the conference, you will be entered to win a 9.7-inch iPad Pro 128 gig Wi-Fi. So, you know, frankly, you should give like lots of $25 donations, because if you win that, you're going to come out ahead. And our donor desk is located outside the exhibit hall on the 4th floor. You can do this online too. And our fiscal year, we changed our fiscal year. Don't ever do this. It's terrible. It's a nightmare. But hopefully it'll pay off one day. Anyhow, the new fiscal year is June 30, so it's only days away, and don't miss out on a chance to be in our donor family. Thank you, everyone. Bus is outside. See you soon.